So the study of representation has long been inseparable from that of architecture. At this point in time, we all know that Le Corbusier was manipulating the media well before Marshall McLuhan was massaging it. We all read buildings as signs, whether as ducts or decorated sheds, and we've all debated the evils as well as the seductions of Photoshop, among other software. To be honest, as the 20th century turned into the 21st, it really didn't look like there was a whole lot more to say about representation in architecture. Postmodernism, with its facile historical allusions and metaphorical heavy-handedness, not to tip my hand, seemed to have killed off the topic of representation, or at least flattened it into a flavorless, thin, zero-calorie disciplinary pancake. And then Neil Levine, the Emmett Blakeney Gleason professor of history of art and architecture at Harvard University, surprised us all by producing a beautifully written, thorough tome, which is also quite heavy, Modern Architecture, Representation, and Reality, which was published last fall by Yale University Press. Levine's book puts terms such as composition, order, and expression back on the table, demonstrating that modernism's relationship to representation did not begin with high modernism in the teens and 20s, but actually stretches as far back as Logier and ends fairly decisively with the advent of postmodernism around 1975. Levine manages to get us to look at issues of meaning, structure, history, and program without reifying singular truths, tectonics, lineage, or function. It's a rich book that's remarkably relevant as we today find ourselves sifting through possibilities of legibility and expression, both as designers and as readers of architecture. On a personal note, Neil to me is as much a friend as he is a scholar. I was lucky to be his student way back when in a seminar on Philip Johnson's houses, a course for which I hope to get extra credit for taking Neil to the Menil House tomorrow afternoon, so I'm hoping I can still push that grade up a little bit. We've since spent many, many hours talking about architecture, looking at architecture, drinking good wine, and eating fresh mussels and oysters culled with some effort right outside his house in Rowley. I'm so very happy to have Neil here for our Cullinan series and invite you to join me in welcoming him to Rice for a lecture that promises to deliver intelligence and sustenance both. Thank you.
Can you hear me well? Sarah, I don't know how your grade could have been better. The one thing I must say, and thank you very much, but the one thing I have to say is that I'm very glad it was Sarah who introduced me and not Ron. And you heard Ron laugh, because Ron knows how to discourage any lecturer by his introductions, or at least that was his manner at Harvard. But generally we agreed on those he put down.
Let me do this.
No. Anyway, to be serious, this talk is very much comes out of the chapter in the book. I was asked to do that. Normally I would be a little concerned about that, but I love this subject, so I don't actually in the end mind. And it should be about 60 minutes. Mies van der Rohe's name has always been synonymous with modern architecture. His buildings and projects of the 1920s were considered exemplary of the modern movement, so much so that the image of his Tugendhat house of the late 1920s was chosen for the cover of the Museum of Modern Art's path-breaking exhibition of modern architecture held in New York in 1932. The name the museum gave to the new architecture, the international style, spoke to its deracinated, ahistorical, universal qualities of formal purity, structural clarity, and above all the abstraction that was considered to be a fundamental consequence and sign of the modern machine aesthetic. The years immediately following the end of World War I witnessed the unprecedented development of an abstract type of painting and sculpture out of the formal inventions of Cubism, which was epitomized for most critics and historians by the group of mainly Dutch artists gathered around Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian, known as De Stijl. Both van Doesburg and Mondrian consciously eliminated all references in their work to representational forms in favor of the pure lines and planes of geometry. By this means, they believed they could transcend the confines of imitation, both of the natural world and the historical bank of images derived from and conventionally associated with it, and thereby reach an ideal, universal condition of spiritual and emotional expression, which Van Doesburg called elementarism and Mondrian pure plasticity. Architectural critics and historians, led by the American Henry Russell Hitchcock, who co-curated the International Style exhibition, and the Swiss Siegfried Giedion, who was the co-founder and major intellectual figure of SIAM, the organization formed in 1928 to promote the goals of the modern movement, were quick to note the dependence of modern architecture on the example of abstract painting and sculpture. In their view, the pure geometric forms of what Le Corbusier called the engineer's aesthetic liberated architects from the historical conventions that had weighed down on the profession and hindered the creation of a truly contemporary building practice relevant to modern times. By this reasoning, it became clear that architecture was not in and of itself an abstract mode of expression, as much previous theory had maintained, but that it was, throughout its history, as much a representational process as was painting or sculpture prior to the advent of abstract art. The main difference was that architecture's representations normally took the form of historical reference, whereas those of painting and sculpture were more visibly grounded in the real world of nature. In both representational architecture and representational painting, as can be seen in these early Renaissance examples, a virtual or ideal set of recognizable figures or elements is perceived as standing for, that is to say, representing, an absent or concealed set of real elements to which they are meant and believed to correspond. The success of the rhetoric lies in its power to make the fiction stand for the reality, to convince the viewer of the truthfulness of the representation. The process of deception occurs in the slippage from truth to verisimilitude, from reality to the appearance or semblance of it. In the unfinished Rucellai Palace, the real rubble-stone construction of the building is masked by a thin veneer of classical ashlar, referring to such historical prototypes as the Roman Colosseum. In order to provide an ideal structure to serve as the visible expression of the building's noble program. But where the palace was left incomplete, as can be seen on the right edge, and you can see it right up there and all the way down here, the distinction between truth and verisimilitude becomes evident. Truth takes a back seat and essentially goes unnoticed. The representational structure predominates and overrides any base consideration of the actual facts of construction. Like a judge's robe, the decorative facing defines the social and institutional role of its bearer, raising that person, or building as the case may be, from the status of the ordinary to a figure of significance and authority. This system of architectural representation was not seriously questioned until the mid-18th century, when Enlightenment thought demanded a more rigorous application of the laws of verisimilitude. From that stemmed the celebrated discussion begun by Marc-Antoine Laugier, postulating a natural source for the forms of classical architecture in an aboriginal primitive hut, devised, as it appears in the frontispiece of his essay on architecture, as a divinely inspired construct, as natural as the trees that form it and the ground from which it literally grows. Laugier maintained that the hut was the model for Greek and Roman architecture, which imitated in stone the putative wooden prototype, and that this transformative process was the only true basis for architectural design. Nature and history were thus aligned in a process of transformation from one material to another, that spoke of the grander transformation from the transience of nature's forms to the permanent record of history. But what started as a neoclassical justification for a systematic and rational deployment of the antique orders inevitably expanded into the larger questions of the relationship between the ideal and the real, between construction and decoration, and between form and function. It is within this continuing discourse of representation that the evolution of modern architectural theory and practice took its bearings. While the embrace of abstraction in the late 19-teens and 20s might appear to have preempted any possible reemergence of representation as a force in architectural design, it was only traditional forms of historical representation that suffered. The process of representation as such, meaning the dialectic of concealment and revelation, aiming to create a virtual reality to stand for and ultimately instead of its underlying material structure, never fully went away. And as new forms of representation came to the surface to redefine avant-garde painting and sculpture, And as new forms of representation came to the surface to redefine avant-garde painting and sculpture, almost unconsciously, as it were, in the case of Jackson Pollock, but then quite pointedly in pop art, so too did representation reemerge in the later work of Mies to provide the architecture he produced in America just before and after World War II, with an unexpected complexity. I will try to describe that evolution in Mies's work. Just to point out, this painting of Pollock has often been talked about. It's a late work just before he died, but you have this typical, quote, Pollock here, and then this portrait, if you see on the right. And it's always been questioned what direction Pollock might have taken after this painting. Of all the modern architects who came to maturity in the 1920s, none achieved a greater degree of abstraction or a more striking expression of the affinity with its pictorial precedent than Mies. Philip Johnson, one of his earliest admirers, went so far as to describe Mies's plan for the 1924 Brick Country House project as looking, quote, less like a diagram of a house than an abstract drawing. He was obviously talking about the plan. Indeed, the comparison of this and other Mies plans with Van Doesburg's 1918 Rhythm of a Russian Dance has become a cliché of modern architectural history. To trace Mies's own conversion from historicist representation to abstraction and his subsequent search for another kind of representation may serve to highlight a pattern that characterized the development of modern architecture and art in general. As was common among his peers, Mies began his career as what Hitchcock described as a new traditionalist. An early house for the Urbig family in Potsdam, Neubabelsberg of 1915-17 is quite typical of his pre-modern work. And this is 1917, with its symmetrical main facade, arched entrance, rendered stucco surface, classically framed windows and French doors, and hip roof with dormer windows. What is rather unusual about Mies, however, is that he continued to employ historical models well into the mid-1920s, coincident with some of his most radical experiments in abstraction. His house for the Mosler family, also in Potsdam, Neubabelsberg, was built between 1924 and 1926, after the design for the Brick Country House, the plan of which Johnson likened to an abstract drawing. Like the Urbig house, the one for the Moslers remained safely within the representational framework of 18th century vernacular classicism. The symmetrical masonry block contained under a high-pitched roof, punctuated by dormer windows, clearly expresses the conservative ethos Hitchcock scorned as part of the new tradition's, quote, pandering to the bourgeois taste for representational prettiness and reminiscent trophies of culture. The synchronicity of the Mosler and Brick Country House makes it clear that for Mies, the move to abstraction was a deliberate and categorical one. It also makes it clear that the move from representation to abstraction in architecture in the 1920s was without precedent and without predictable consequences. The abstraction of the Brick Country House was radical. It had nothing to do with the simplified, stylized historical dealing of the Mosler and Urbig houses that came to characterize the strict classicism of the, quote, modernistic architecture of the period. The very fact that Mies named the project after the material employed in its construction points to the significance the geometric modularity of the brick played in the design. The elementary expression of disaggregated volumes and interweaving lines that Mies admired in Frank Lloyd Wright's work also undoubtedly had an impact. But there can be little question that the Brick Country House's non-representational abstraction owed most to the aesthetic of dynamic, interlocking lines and sliding planes that Van Doesburg had introduced in his Rhythm of a Russian Dance. Mies had known the painter since 1920 or 21, worked with him on the journal Gay, and few have ever doubted the influence Van Doesburg exerted on him. For van Doesburg, however, abstraction meant much more than a way of art making. It had important social value. It was a release from the subjective, illusory eclecticism that characterized 19th century bourgeois society. The new world of space it opened up spoke directly of transcendent spiritual values through its universally understandable, rationally ordered, and reproducible system of forms. Such a utopian vision neatly dovetailed with the social and political aims of modern architecture, which called for a mass housing of a prefabricated, standardized sort, grounded in a functional and hygienic rigor. Although Mies did participate in some of the socially driven programs of early modernism, notably in his direction of the Weissenhofsiedlung housing exhibition in Stuttgart, his interest in abstraction focused mainly on artistic issues. His major achievements in the later 1920s were in the area of exhibition design and domestic architecture of a particularly refined and elegant sort. The two most remarkable and well-known examples of this are the German Pavilion for the Barcelona International Exhibition and the Tugendhat House we already saw, both designed and built between 1928 and 1930. The so-called Barcelona Pavilion was intended to show off products of German industry. Set on one end of a plinth, whose other end is occupied by a shallow reflecting pool, the structure is composed of a grid of chrome-encased steel columns supporting a thin slab roof. Freestanding planes of glass, polished marble, and onyx slide between roof and floor to partition the space and direct its flow. The transparent and reflective surfaces deny a sense of physical exertion to the structure and thereby dematerialize it. Lacking any explicit reference to pre-existing natural or historical models, the structure is read as a three-dimensional spatial network of flat planes and thin lines of a completely abstract order. The chrome-encased cruciform columns foreground this denial of classical representation and become the design's most telling feature. Having neither base nor capital, they appear to have been extruded from a purely rational idea of point support, punctuating the space as they delineate its underlying grid. Mies remained in Germany throughout most of the 1930s, during which time he continued to produce an architecture committed to the ideals of abstraction. The only significant change being an increased emphasis on monumentality, achieved in large part through the use of symmetry he had avoided in the previous decade. This can be seen in his project for a pavilion for the Third Reich, for the Brussels International Exhibition of 1935, that was produced shortly after Hitler's putsch and assumption of the title of Führer, and in full cognizance of the need to create an architecture to symbolize the new Nazi regime. A sketch of the exterior shows an enormous imperial eagle over the main entrance, flanked by tall poles flying the flags of the German state and the National Socialist Party. The grand interior court of honor features a second imperial eagle directly opposite the entrance. It is flanked by a partition wall on the left inscribed with the words Deutsche Reich, and one on the right inscribed with a giant swastika. Each of these side walls is preceded by an altar-like table, the one on the left being supported by svelte, ionic-looking capitals, the one on the right possibly intended as a base for sculpture. Aside from the explicit use of classical and political symbols, the building remains starkly modern and can thus be interpreted as part of Mies's continuing effort, even in the face of the aggressive return to classical representation favored by Hitler, to promote an architecture of geometric abstraction as an appropriate way to express the collective ideals and technological prowess of the new Nazi state. This effort would last into early 1937. Well beyond the time when most of the avant-garde circle with whom he was previously associated had left Germany to go into exile. By contrast, Mies joined a number of National Socialist organizations and even signed a petition in support of Hitler, all of which has raised certain questions and even suspicions about his politics. Although Sybil Moholy-Nagy, the wife of Laszlo, Mies's former colleague at the Bauhaus, called Mies a traitor, and others have described him as an opportunist, scholarly opinion is almost undivided in maintaining that Mies's attempts to work with Hitler's regime merely illustrate a dogged belief in the possibility of convincing the Nazis of the value of modern architecture for their cause, as well as his complete naivete and disinterest in matters political. Whatever the case, Mies decided in 1937 that it was time to cut ties and leave his homeland. After a preliminary trip to the United States in the late summer of that year, in the fall of 1938, he settled permanently in Chicago, where he was appointed director of the Department of Architecture at the Armour Institute of Technology, which became the Illinois Institute of Technology in early 1940, and embarked on a second career that took his architecture in a substantially different direction. In the turbulent years between 1938, when he settled in America as an enemy alien, and 1943, when the first component of his master plan for IIT was nearing completion, Mies produced 3 designs for projects that remain in the form of the collages by which they are best known, among the most significant works of his entire career, and absolutely crucial for understanding its post-war evolution. Rarely viewed or studied as a group, the Reiser House, the Concert Hall, and the Museum for a Small City share a particularly powerful set of formal and expressive concerns that force us to think about how one should read their imagery and content, both in terms of their immediate wartime context and as a basis for the re-engagement with representation and the consequent movement away from abstraction that Mies's architecture came to manifest after the war. Fundamental to this development were, first, that Mies now chose the pictorial medium of collage as the one best suited to his expressive purposes, and second, that the ready-made images he incorporated were by no means neutral in political and cultural terms. The method of appropriation and application implicit in the collage technique soon informed the system of structural expression he developed in his actual buildings at IIT, and ultimately became his way of characterizing and representing what he liked to call the will of the epoch, and what President Eisenhower was to describe as the growing danger of America's military-industrial complex. Although it is axiomatic to any analysis of Mies's architecture that his career can be neatly divided into 2 halves, the earlier German period and the later American phase, with each having its own particular structural and spatial characteristics, a rigorous continuity of philosophical purpose is generally held to underlie and unify the 2 halves in a seamless, almost timeless fashion. The interregnum of emigration and war are deemed to have had no significant effect on the architect's pursuit of an architecture of pure structure and pure space, in other words, abstraction. A world of form whose meaning lies in the abstraction of expression devolving from those 2 absolutes. Certainly, Mies's own silence on matters such as government policy, ideology, or leadership lends support to the commonly held view that he was totally apolitical, disengaged from the social problems of his time and their mundane quotidian aspects. It is therefore hardly surprising that the abstractionist reading of the Mies of the 1920s and 30s has carried over into the wartime and post-war work. Despite their rather blatant political references, the first projects he designed in America, like the Concert Hall, have invariably been described as simply predicting the focus on the purely formal aspects of structure and space of his subsequent steel and glass buildings of the later 1940s, 50s, and 60s, of which there is a major one in Houston. In fact, the disinclination to acknowledge representational imagery initially forced critics into a position of almost consciously having to avoid accurate description. When first Philip Johnson and then Arthur Drexler, both close acquaintances of Mies, described the Concert Hall collage that the architect created by pasting pieces of colored paper and a reproduction of a Mayol sculpture over a photograph of the interior of a wartime American assembly plant that was then being used to manufacture planes for bombing Germany, they both refused to admit the project's ready-made aspect, leaving the reader to assume that Mies had been responsible for designing the structure from scratch rather than merely retrofitting it. In the text of his monograph on Mies accompanying the architect's exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1947, Johnson simply noted how in the Concert Hall, quote, walls and ceilings are pulled apart and disposed within a truss steel cage so that space eddies in all directions among interior planes of subaqueous weightlessness, end quote. According to Drexler's more disingenuous account 13 years later, quote, here in the Concert Hall project, interior columns have been eliminated. They are replaced by a vast steel truss of the sort used in airplane hangars or factories. In the entirely free space this roof makes possible, Drexler went on, Mies suspends completely separate wall and ceiling planes, thus fulfilling, in the author's view, the architect's exclusively formal program. Although later commentators have noted the identity of the pre-existing photograph, the meaning that a bomber plant might have had as the basis for a concert hall, designed soon after the United States entered World War II, has continued to remain undiscussed, thus preserving the abstract formalist interpretation of the project. It would be wrong, however, to assume that all of Mies's work has evaded sociopolitical interpretation. Indeed, there is one important and highly relevant group of projects, the so-called courthouses designed just before he left Germany, that provide a basis for an alternative point of view. While using the same formal language and compositional system of the Barcelona Pavilion, these consistently inward-turning designs have often been described as registering a sense of withdrawal from the hostile world of Berlin of the mid-1930s, and thus expressing a mood of isolation, even escapism. This is three houses, each with its own internal court, and walled from the exterior world beyond it. It is therefore important to note that the courthouse became one of Mies's prime building types after leaving Germany, especially in his teaching curriculum for IIT, although it underwent a significant change in being rendered through collage. This collage technique was initially used by Mies in the Rieser House project that brought him to the United States for the first time in 1937. While these drawings clearly evince a sense of alienation and estrangement that can be related to the previous Berlin designs, there is something radically different in them. In response to the social and political environment of Berlin in the mid-30s, the courthouses reflected a subtle shift in expression through a realignment of forms. The American collages, with their physical imprint of elements from the real world, register a more profound change that speaks not merely of isolation or escape, but of the search to construct a new practice and a new identity in a world where things could no longer be considered natural and transparent, but had to be reviewed in all their opacity as objects of representation. The three projects we shall now turn to can be seen as responses to the profound dislocation of exile and consequent trauma of living and working as an enemy alien in time of war. Helen and Stanley Rieser, vice president and president respectively of the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, the biggest in the world at the time, were important collectors of modern painting with strong ties to New York's Museum of Modern Art. They owned a large ranch along the Snake River in the Grand Teton Mountains near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which they used as a vacation retreat. A creek branching off from the river and running through the property defined the eastern edge of the flat area where the log cabins they lived in were located. Just north of a dam in the creek was a group of farm buildings you can see in the background. These unassuming structures were dwarfed by the snow-capped mountains looming behind them. Having decided to build a new guest cottage as well as a new main house that would straddle the creek and thus take maximum advantage of the view, the Riesers hired Philip Goodwin, whom they knew through their connections with MoMA. He had been the architect of the Museum of Modern Art. This was probably sometime in late 1935 or early 1936. The guest cottage was built as planned, but disagreements soon occurred, and Goodwin was temporarily replaced by Mark Peter, a recent Harvard Architecture School graduate. A service wing was built on the east bank, and concrete piers supporting a wooden platform were constructed in the creek to carry the major living space above it. This work was in place by the summer of 1937 when Mies arrived on the scene. Looking for a way to get Mies out of Germany and to the United States, Alfred Barr, director of the Museum of Modern Art and particularly close to Helen Rieser, supported the Riesers in their decision to turn the job over to Mies. Helen Rieser asked Barr to contact the architect on her behalf in early February 1937, and in July she interviewed Mies in Paris and offered him the job. He visited the Wyoming site for 2 weeks in August. After stopping in Chicago, where he met with the advisory committee of the Armour Institute of Technology to discuss the possibility of directing the school's architecture program, Mies spent the fall and winter of 1937-38 in New York, completing the redesign of the Wyoming house in the office of his two former Bauhaus students, John Barney Rogers and William Priestley. He returned to Germany in early April to settle his affairs prior to taking up the directorship he had been offered in the meantime at AIT. The contract drawings for the Reiser House were produced by Rogers and Priestley under Mies's close supervision. The design preserved the already built structure and more or less doubled it on the other side of the stream, creating an open-plan, glass-walled space between the two blocks on the existing platform. The steel frame and wood structure was to be sheathed in cypress panels and incorporate large areas of plate glass and fieldstone masonry. The plan shows the eccentrically shaped block on the east reused as a service wing, a new block on the west bank housing the bedrooms, and a central open living dining space articulated by cruciform-shaped columns, as in the Barcelona Pavilion, supporting the flat roof which is cantilevered well beyond the edge of the floor-to-ceiling window walls. Construction on the house proceeded in fits and starts over the next few years, but was finally abandoned in 1943 after a spring flood washed away the existing piers and service building. So nothing's there. Most interesting for us, however, is the way in which Mies developed the design in the form of two extraordinary collages. One looking south on the right and the other north, in the direction of the existing farm buildings, visible in the photograph we saw earlier, which was supplied to Mies by the Riesels. The collages are in fact perspectives, seen from the living room that bridges the stream. But instead of extending the space into depth, as the foreshortened lines of internal columns and window mullions would imply, and you can see it on the drawing here and there, and not as well, obviously, on the other one, but you can on the ceiling. The compositions of cut and pasted photographs sandwich the room to compress the space into a strange, depthless void. Foreground becomes background and vice versa. Architecture as construction disappears in this photographic tabula rasa. The blank vertical lines of the cruciform-shaped columns and window mullions and the horizontal planes of floor and ceiling are treated as reserved negative spaces, cutting, surrounding, and providing the neutral, two-dimensional ground for the freestanding objects in the room and the photographic images of the landscape, hermetically sealing it and pressing in from the outside. The view to the south shows the mountains in forced perspective, with a greatly enlarged color reproduction of a Paul Klee painting bought by the Riesers in December 1937, acting as a floor-to-ceiling room divider behind a wood veneer service bar. The sense of disorientation and displacement is physically reinforced by the deliberate play on distance and perspective. The view in the other direction, to the snow-capped Tetons, provides even fewer spatial indices, foregrounding the image of the mountains as a matter of topographic location rather than a continuous field of human occupation. Indeed, a preliminary version of the collage, looking north, offers many more indications of local culture, such as the rustic bridge in the foreground and the nearby barn and ranch buildings that we saw in the photograph. As they were cropped out in the final version, the singular drama of the scene made it seem as if nothing else was there but the mountains. The spatial discontinuity and sense of alienation conveyed by the collages contrast palpably with many of the country house designs Mies had produced in Germany in the earlier part of the decade. In the project of the mid-30s for the Hube House at Magdeburg, a delicate perspectival drawing weaves interior and exterior together in a composition where space, structure, and landscape are seen and felt as transparent to and integral with one another. The sense of being at home in the world contrasts with the unheimlich quality of the Reiser House. In large part, this has to do with the difference between the seamless continuity of the drawing and the abrupt transitions and dislocations of the collage. This leads us to consider the Reiser House in relation to Mies's earlier photomontages, the technique he favored in the 20s. In his 1929 project for the redevelopment of Berlin's Alexanderplatz, there is a similar opposition, as in the Reiser House, of light and dark, of new construction and existing environment. But in the earlier photomontage, the new is highlighted in contrast to the old. The modern buildings are foregrounded with an auratic glow, while the surrounding environment is seen in dreary relief. In the Reiser House, the priorities are reversed. The building's modern structure is dematerialized, almost to the point of self-denial, while the surrounding environment is made the positive visual presence. One can almost speak here of an absence of volition, a submission to forces beyond one's control. The continuous surface and hierarchically gradated design for the Alexanderplatz showed the architect to be in control, manipulating the existing urban fabric and asserting a new presence in the center. In the Rieser House, modern technology is reduced to a mere frame, and a negative one at that, for editing a distant, alien, and unfamiliar nature. The photographic representation of the landscape preserves and asserts its exteriority to the perceiving subject, as a conventional perspectival rendering would not. The architecture registers the mountain's existence as a fact, outside and beyond, yet constantly in view. The collage technique reinforces the impression of the environment's otherness. These signs of alienation and displacement read as powerful expressions of the experience of exile in a personal and general, rather than a specifically political sense. Between the Rieser House and the new campus for IIT, which he began planning in 1939, and where he completed the Minerals and Metals Research Building in 1942-43, his first building in the United States, Mies designed two hypothetical large public structures that gave expression to the political dimension through explicit references to the war in Europe. The first was the concert hall, and the second the Museum for a Small City. The concert hall, which is generally dated to 1941-42, was described by Mies's biographer Franz Schulze as arguably, quote, the pivotal work of his career. Philip Johnson highlighted the project in the 1947 retrospective of the architect's work at MoMA and described it in the exhibition catalog as Mies's most astounding creation. As an indication of the significance he himself attached to the design, Mies offered the collage as a present to his lover, the sculptor Mary Callery, whom he met around the time of the exhibition and who eventually donated it to the Museum of Modern Art to form a centerpiece of their collection of Mies's drawings, and I might add, who changed this image to one of her own choosing. Both in its formal and political implications, the collage represents one of the most provocative moves in the history of 20th century architecture. As Mies scholars have consistently asserted, it is the first example of the type of universal space that would characterize many of the architect's most unusual and influential designs of the post-war period. But as a collage, pure and simple, meaning an autonomous work of art, and it was nothing other than that since it was accompanied by no plans, no elevations, nor any sections, it had much more radical implications. Instead of designing the building himself, Mies used a photograph of one that had recently been published and merely inserted his spatial arrangement and iconographic treatment by means of collage. The Mies building thus became a kind of assisted ready-made, to use Marcel Duchamp's term. The photograph, which we already saw, was of Albert Kahn's assembly building for the Glenn Martin aircraft plant at Middle River, Maryland, built in 1937 and published by George Nelson in a monograph on Kahn 2 years later, which Mies owned. The Kahn building was a landmark in the history of engineering. With its 300-foot-long, 30-foot-deep trusses, it was the largest flat span ever constructed. But this was not merely technology for technology's sake. The structure's purpose was to provide a large enough column-free space for the manufacture of the Martin Mars airplane. Designed to serve the Navy as a flying battleship with a range of 5,000 miles and a payload of 35,000 pounds, this major investment in America's accelerating preparations for war had a 200-foot wingspan, the largest of any plane at the time. The Kahn building was also used to manufacture the B-26 bomber, the A-30 Maryland fighter plane used by France and Brittany against Germany beginning in 1939, and the PBM-1 Mariner, designed specifically to destroy German submarines. In the photograph published by Nelson, there is a China Clipper, the prototype of the Mars, a Maryland, and a B-26 behind it, as well as a PBM-1 Mariner to the far right in front of the dark partition. By the time Mies fixed upon the photograph of the Martin Assembly Building, the United States had entered the war, and the planes being manufactured in it had begun to attack German positions. For a German living in America, to call this image highly charged can hardly be an overstatement. Unlike the collages for the Rieser House, which were constructed in effect of planes of paper, here Mies worked by a gradual and deliberate process of negation, erasing, defacing, and masking evidence of the actual airplanes. After cropping the photograph top and bottom and enlarging it into a photostat, he apparently first blacked out the small Mariner on the right, along with the high wing and propellers of the China Clipper in the center, by inking in the spaces between the Bendé dots. The next step was to overlay the perspectively adjusted pieces of white, gray, and yellow paper forming the floor, ceiling, and walls of the auditorium proper, leaving visible only a group of men just to the right of center in front of the B-26. They were then obliterated, and along with them almost any suggestion of the airplane behind. What's happening? Oh, they were then obliterated, and along with them almost any suggestion of the airplane behind by an overlay consisting of a reproduction of the French sculptor Aristide Maillol's figure of the Mediterranean, which is the one that Mary Callery replaced with an Egyptian scribe, and that's why this collage is never seen in color, because it doesn't exist anymore. Originally called La Pensée, or Thought, the Maillol sculpture diverts attention from the background by confronting the viewer head-on with its inwardly directed expression of contemplation. Insulated from the surrounding factory by the panels of the auditorium shell, this image of self-absorption defines a zone of silence within what would otherwise be an indescribable din of machine tools, motors, and metalworking. The silencing of the noise of airplane manufacture becomes the oral metaphor for the visual masking of its production. Why, one might ask, make this Sisyphean effort to fabricate concert hall conditions out of an acoustic nightmare, if not to foreground the very process of denial and negation underlying the act of introspection? Support for this conjecture is offered by the collage of the Museum for a Small City that Mies produced the following year, for which he chose as the focal image the most celebrated anti-war and most explicitly anti-German work of art of the time, Picasso's painting Guernica. The Museum for a Small City was the response to a commission by Architectural Forum in early February 1943 for its May issue devoted to the creation of an ideal American small city for the post-war period. Mies was asked to design a church, but chose a museum. The site, at the heart of the hypothetical town center, forms one side of the main plaza, adjoining Charles Eames's City Hall and facing the concert hall and civic auditorium. A sketchy perspective of the pavilion-like building, however, portrays it in an idealized setting more reminiscent of the Teton Mountains than of the urban site it was supposed to occupy. The collages of the museum's interior are in fact clearly dependent on the earlier Rieser house, evincing the same type of planar composition akin to Picasso's most classical papier-collé of 1912 or so. Among the collages of the museum, there is one in particular, however, that illustrates what Mies stated was the driving force of the design. That was, as he wrote, to create a space for Picasso's painting of Guernica so that, quote, it can be shown to greatest advantage, becoming an element in space against a changing background. While this description has led critics and historians to assume that Mies approached the project as purely a formal problem in abstract museum design, the images themselves tell another story of a more representational order. Guernica is placed in the middle ground, slightly off-center. It is framed by two Maillol figures, Night on the right and the Monument to Cézanne on the left. Behind are photographs of foliage on the right and water on the left. Nature becomes the serene background for culture. But unlike the Rieser house, though similar to the concert hall, the flat cutouts here describe a perspectival space in which Picasso's painting, the only scene of activity, is isolated in space and time like an event still unfolding. Maillol's Night, which turns its back on the painting, acts as a repoussoir figure, situating the image of war in the deep recesses of the mind, in sleep, somewhere between dream and reality. Based on such a reading, it is difficult not to see in this premonition of André Malraux's photograph-inspired Museum Without Walls a reaction to the terror of a new form of technological warfare that the photographs of Guernica's bombing had broadcast to the world just a few years before. The incorporation of the Picasso painting depicting the German Luftwaffe's brutal destruction of the Basque town of Guernica in late April 1937 could hardly have been taken by Mies as simply a formal problem. The painting's continual public display as the most powerful representation of anti-war, anti-Nazi propaganda began in the early summer of 1937 when it was exhibited in José Luis Serre's Spanish Pavilion at the Paris World's Fair as an act of protest against the Franco regime. Mies visited Paris, as we remember, in early July to meet Helen Riesel, just a few weeks after the much celebrated and highly controversial installation of Picasso's painting. He also returned to the city in mid-August. After touring Scandinavia and Great Britain in 1938 and 39, the painting was brought to the United States in May 1939 by the Spanish Refugee Relief Campaign for a series of stops in various cities. It was exhibited twice in Chicago, where Mies was then living, first in the fall of 1939 at the Chicago Arts Club, and then in early 1940 at the Chicago Art Institute. Wherever it was displayed, the painting evoked powerful feelings about the horrors of war and the dehumanizing effects of the technology driving it, symbolized by Picasso in the central light bulb. Mies's construction of a museum without walls to show Guernica to greatest advantage leaves no doubt that he was aware of the painting's message. Like the painting itself, Mies's collage is drained of natural color. The modern nightmare depicted by Picasso is framed in a discourse of sleep, dream, and nature's timeless rhythms. In the face of the event, the human is reduced to a state of inaction, personified by what the French writer André Gide described as the muteness of Mayol's figures. Before the war, Wilhelm Leenbroek and Georg Kolbe were Mies's favorite sculptors. Now the French neoclassicist Mayol took the place of the German expressionists as his figural interlocutor. The ambiguity of Mayol's figures may well have been the attraction. Does Night refuse to look at what is going on behind her back? Is she ashamed of what she has seen? Is her posture an expression of sorrow or despair? All these questions and more are inevitably brought to mind by the narrative of the museum as collage. Considered together as pendants, the concert hall and the museum reinforce each other's political and representational content. Mayol's enigmatic role as mediator links the two projects while magnifying the questions they leave unresolved. The political message of the concert hall is clearly not as straightforward as, say, Lisitsky's contemporaneous work for the Stalinist regime, although it is not for that reason any less political or representational. In his 1941 poster entitled "Make More Tanks," Lisitsky used all the avant-garde conventions of the 20s to dramatize the collective Soviet wartime effort. The white halos around the tank and plane reified the thoughts in the minds of the workers, leading them toward a positive goal. The elements of collage in Mies's projects have the opposite effect, erasing and wiping from the mind almost all evidence of war. This necessarily brings up the question of how to read the designs in relation to the war. The combined meaning of the concert hall and the museum is surely a complex one, to which we may never really be able to give a definitive answer. I should like, however, to offer some suggestions. Let me begin with the matter of program. In their devotion to music on the one hand and fine arts on the other, these two civic projects can be seen as instituting a kind of aesthetic defense against the war. Yet the replacement of the destructive war machinery by constructive cultural activity in the concert hall, along with the primacy of place given to Picasso's Guernica in the museum, could lead one to interpret the projects as a profession of anti-war sentiment. But the character of the painting's installation, combined with the concert hall's silence on the subject, raises certain doubts. In the museum, the painting of the Nazi bombing is framed by two works of art and situated against a background of water and foliage. In the concert hall, the evidence of war is obliterated by the very act of sublimation the building performs to come into being. War, in effect, is naturalized and aestheticized by the act of collage. And so one might ask, is it not also neutralized? Here, too, we find we must defer. Although Mies's collages can be seen as going that one step further and becoming a denial of the very condition of war itself, an attempt to turn one's back to the evidence and refuse to look it in the eye. This, of course, would fit in with Mies's apolitical image. But if that were the case, why would he have gone to the trouble of producing such politically charged images in the first place? A reasonable response might be that no matter how much Mies tried to distance himself from everyday affairs, the war, if only because of his own enemy-alien status, surely weighed heavily on his mind and raised certain issues about the interrelationship of architecture, politics, and culture that demanded to be acknowledged and ultimately represented in built form. During the war, while Mies's activities were essentially limited to the drafting board, collage became a crucial means for such investigation. The inherent ambiguities of collage, as opposed to the more unified and totalizing character of his earlier photomontage technique, became the architectural correlative of his evolving political thought. Following the adoption of this new method in the Rieser House, where it registered the condition of alienation and exile by the distancing of subject from object, Mies pressed the medium in the concert hall into a unique form of construction by occlusion that internalized the effects of war and represented, through figures of denial and silence, and against the powerful background of American industry, the sense of limbo one might have experienced as a German émigré at the time. And finally, in the Museum for the Small City, Mies manipulated the shifting, multi-layered possibilities of the collage technique to project a more direct, though no less ambiguous, and even more complex statement about the war in Europe. After the war, Mies's architecture underwent a decisive revision, based in large measure on ideas adumbrated in the collages of the three wartime projects we have looked at. Franz Schulze, Fritz Neumeier, and others have stressed the formal precedent they variously provided for the prismatic shape, static composition, large-scale, clear-span space, and structural expression of Mies's later work. In the concluding section of this talk, however, I will focus on a more substantive issue, deriving from the conception of figurative imagery and representational means the collages as collages display, in order to show how that underwrote the changes Mies effected in his system of design and ultimately determined the later architecture's content. Central to this discussion will be Mies's adoption of the standard American rolled steel I-beam as the ready-made signifier of a new structural order of representation. Mies first used exposed steel I-beams, or more precisely wide flange beams, and you can see them here, in the Minerals and Metals Research Building undertaken as part of America's wartime effort. But it was only in 1946-47, with the completion of the buildings at the formal center of the campus, like the Navy building, that the question of representation came to the surface, literally to the surface. In these, for the first time, Mies externalized the steel structure of the building as an essentially decorative and representational construct, acknowledging the applied, indeed collaged, character of the elements by stopping them just short of the ground, as you can see all along here. For reasons of fireproofing, he had to encase the ice-shaped steel columns in concrete. But unlike earlier Chicago architects who faced the same problem, Mies believed that to give the internal structure visible expression, he had to represent or replicate it in the same material on the building surface. As Mies later commented, there was what might be called a good reason for such a solution, and then there was the real reason. The good reason was that the channels of the exposed I-beams could act as receptacles for the aluminum window mullions and brick infill panels. But the real reason, as is made even clearer in the plan for 860-880 North Lakeshore Drive, which followed these buildings soon after, was an aesthetic one. There, the attached I-beams, which stiffen the frame, set up an insistent and overall rhythm of vertical elements that represent the concealed structure for expressive purposes. So let us consider how the three wartime projects provided the basis for this development. The first thing to note is that the I-beam was entirely new to Mies's vocabulary and contrasted in almost every way with the typical cruciform-shaped support he favored since the 1920s. Where the I-beam asserts a strong figural presence with a face, a back, and a solid vertical spine, the cruciform-shaped column is a negative, inward-turning form. It is perceived as the linear abstraction of a point support. This was further emphasized by the reflective chrome casing that Mies often used to sheathe the four steel angles bolted together to form the column's cross-section. The plan of the Barcelona Pavilion columns reveals another interesting fact. The center of the construct, as you can see here, is hollow, reinforcing our reading of the column, not as a figure of support, but as an abstract marker of space. It defines the internal edges of the floor's square grid and manifests, in purely spatial terms, the point of intersection of the planes. As a delineation of conjunction and crossing, the shimmering chrome-sheathed column is as abstract as the Cartesian grid it defines. Mies continued to employ this type of support in the Rieser house, where it was to have been encased in bronze, and in the Museum for a Small City. But in these cases, the abstraction of the form came into conflict with the objective reality of the photographic. The contrast with the ready-made, sheer physical presence of the photograph in the Rieser house threw into bold relief the column's dematerialized, non-objective character. And this to such an extent that the cruciform-shaped support no longer appeared as a positive point of intersecting planes, but rather as a negative cut or gap in the picture of reality presented in the view of the landscape. The cruciform column thus became a void that had to be filled, and would almost immediately be, as in the Farnsworth house, by the ready-made structural reality of the more assertive, wide-flange, I-shaped column. In the Farnsworth house, the physical reality of the steel structure in the background of the concert hall is forcefully brought into the foreground as the building's declarative image. Though not strictly representational in Lauger's terms, since the exposed columns do not portray anything hidden, the whiteness of their painted surface nevertheless transforms the standard steel members into something other than a mere structural apparatus. Like actors on stage, the members seem to be playing a special role in an architectural drama and are thus, in effect, idealized. More important for us, however, is the way in which the photographic reality of the figure of the landscape in the Rieser house seems to have imploded in on the structural voids of its architectural ground to re-emerge within the exterior frame of the Farnsworth house with a physical presence that now gives the structure a figural role of its own. As the embodiment of a new technological order, the I-shaped columnar figure positively defines, as it frames and reflects, the surrounding landscape. We can now see how the figure ground reversal may have occurred by revisiting the concert hall, the project that lay on the cusp of Mies's changeover from the cruciform to the I-shaped column. At the same time, we will be able to see more clearly what this reversal implies about the question of concealment and expression of meaning. From the point of view of representation, the concert hall can be read as an inversion of the Rieser house. In the house, the physical reality of the ready-made imagery is given over to the non-architectural elements. In the concert hall, by contrast, it is the architectural structure that is made physically present through the photograph. And where the structure is kept in reserve in the house, obstructing a continuous view of the landscape, in the concert hall the applied planes of paper that mask the structure and its graphic contents. Thus, when the reality of the ready-made imagery finally takes on the positive form of the steel structure of Albert Kahn's airplane factory, its connotations and supplementary meanings relating to the military-industrial complex are concealed from the observer's aesthetic attentions. Because of its idealizing whiteness and bucolic setting, the Farnsworth house appeared, to Fritz Neumeier, to exemplify the process of transformation and sublimation that lies at the core of artistic representation. And for this reason, he compared the house to Lauger's hut. But it is Mies's more typical buildings, like the ones at IIT and the double apartment block on North Lakeshore Drive, that provide the more instructive and that prove more instructive and enlightening, for the very fact that they had to accommodate those realities of construction, such as fireproofing, that a one-story building like the Farnsworth house didn't have to do, that forced the architect to make the distinction between the real and the ideal, or truth and verisimilitude, and thus give us the evidence of deception, which is to say the illusion that is a fundamental aspect of the process of representation. Mies's system of representation, while grounded in a theory of fiction, no less absolute than that of Alberti or Lauger, was different from the earlier conceptions in an important way. Where classical and neoclassical architects placed little artistic value on the real physical substrate of a building and invested the process of transformation from one material to another with transcendental meaning, Mies refused to disregard the facts of construction in the representational operation. Nor did he see the need to give the outward expression of the inner construction a substantially different shape or even material form of existence. Mies thus came to terms with the reliance on the thing in itself that lay at the core of modern abstraction, at the same time as he restored to representation some of its historical force. The attached I-beams in Mies's post-war buildings are neither the structure itself nor merely a heterogeneous expression of it. Rather, they are, as Robert Venturi noted, rhetorical, meaning representational. Those who have dealt with this matter in any great detail have tended to describe the Miesian solution, especially as it evolved at North Lakeshore Drive, and this remained consistent then throughout his career, either as a form of symbolic substitution or as a matter of metaphor. In what remains the most interesting and extensive treatment of this subject, William Geordie called the applied I-beams a surrogate of the actual structure and characterized Mies's rhythmic groupings of them, quote, as the symbolic pilasters of his builded art. In employing these I-beams, quote, to articulate the walls, much as pilasters articulated a classical or Renaissance wall, Mies and Geordie's view reinvigorated the whole of the classicizing tradition for present use. End quote. Thomas Beebe, in a general discussion of the idea of ornament in modern architecture, spoke of, quote, the very sophisticated ornamental device of the attached I-beams as a visual metaphor for the structure behind, acutely noting that the steel mullions are merely a reiteration and not a transformation of what lies underneath. In idealizing the actual structure rather than imitating an ideal one, Mies's collaged I-beams do not represent something other than what they are. They function as signs of what cannot be seen otherwise. In sidestepping the issue of illusionism by short-circuiting the question of credibility, the reiterated I-beams redefine the process of meaning and meaning of representation in quintessentially modern terms, as a matter of signification through a new type of ready-made figuration. The form I-beam is neither invented nor reinvented. It is, as Geordie noted, quote, just the utterly commonplace, banal stock item of the steel mill. Such is what Mies had in mind, I think, when he would paraphrase Thomas Aquinas saying, truth is the significance of facts. Mies's represented structure signifies the factual conditions on which its being depends and from which it draws its meaning. As an idealization of these conditions, it gives new meaning to the modern myth of the thing in itself, and thereby collapses the idea of abstraction into a new and credible form of representation. The history of modern art and architecture has been written mainly from the point of view of abstraction. So it is difficult to comprehend fully the significance and changing character of the representational impulse that has been equally at work within it. It is no doubt for this reason that Clement Greenberg referred to Jasper Johns' work of the 1950s and early 60s as a prime example of the, quote, homeless representation he traced back to the influence of Cubism. Though lacking any true ground in a traditional sense of the word, Johns' literalist form of reproduction was, in the critic's view, alien to modern abstract practices, his, quote, sculptures amounting to nothing more than what they really are. Everything that usually serves representation and illusion, Greenberg continued, is left to serve nothing but itself, that is, abstraction, while everything that usually serves the abstract is put to the service of representation. Thinking of Mies in terms of Johns' nearly contemporary cast bronze sculptures of commonplace objects might therefore be of some use in understanding the broader implications of what occurred worldwide, though perhaps first and most trenchantly in American art and architecture of the post-war period. Like Mies's I-beams, Johns' light bulb redefines representation in the mechanical terms of replication and reproduction. Literality, even more than metaphor, is the issue. Muteness and silence are the operative terms of expression. The material presence of a common object, the thing in itself, becomes a means for questioning the loss of subjectivity and the increasing abstraction and anonymity of modern life. Seriality and the attendant flattening out of experience is one result of mechanical reproduction, as Andy Warhol showed in his multiple representations of silkscreened photographs ranging from Campbell's soup cans and dollar bills to electric chairs and disasters. In his 1965 painting of an atomic bomb blast, drives home the power of modernist representation to disclose, in unexpected ways, things that otherwise might be allowed to slip back into the recesses of the mind. Yet no matter how literal and seemingly self-evident the image appears, there is always a blur. By definition, representation entails the concealing of something else, something that is both suggested by its replacement, as well as something we are dissuaded from thinking about by that very act of replacement. To begin to correlate in our mind's eye the seen and the unseen, the known and the unknown, we first have to identify the signs. If we are eventually to understand what Mises architecture represents in terms of modern culture and its history, we must at the outset try to determine what value and meaning to assign to the I-beam, the sign par excellence of the architect's representational vocabulary. There can be little doubt that steel, especially for the European looking to America for a vision of modernity in the 1920s and 30s, was not a neutral, value-free material. Both Richard Neutra, in his 1927 book, Wie baut Amerika, and Eric Mendelsohn, in his America of 1 year earlier, depicted the application of the products of the steel industry to architecture in a quasi-utopian light. Steel, and later aluminum, represented as perhaps no other materials did the power and force of modern industry, initially embodied in the railroad, then in the ocean liner and automobile, and finally in the manufacture of airplanes. It was a force both for good and for ill. Mies clearly pondered the meaning of all this long and hard. Quote, "Technology is far more than a method," he wrote in 1950. "It is a world in itself." In Mises' view, it was technology that distinguished the modern age from all previous periods in history and defined in objective and expressive terms, as he stated, quote, "the inner structure of the epoch out of which a true architecture arises." But technology, he promises both power and grandeur, a dangerous promise for a man who has been created neither for one nor for the other. And it's important to remember this is a person who came out of Nazi Germany. Although Mies often presented himself as merely an instrument of this power, serving it rather than ruling it, as he would say, he surely saw in its unalloyed expression in the Martin Assembly Building something that needed editing and even commentary. However we wish to interpret it, the process of editing involved concealment and sublimation. That editing and that sublimation took a different course once the war was over. At that point, the power of technology came to the surface. It was represented and made into an order with all the authority the classical orders once had, though without their metaphorical transparency. Mises' architecture symbolized American achievements in the Cold War, as in this cover of the Polish language magazine published in Washington for distribution behind the Iron Curtain. Mies openly celebrated and gave ideal form to the industrial machinery that had brought Allied victory in World War II and his adopted country of the United States to its position of international power. His new technological order encoded those facts and gave modern architecture, for nearly a quarter of a century, a lingua franca commensurate with them. In this light, Mises' wartime experience, as viewed through the collages of the Rieser House, Concert Hall, and Museum for a Small City, seems less like an interregnum in his career than a time of profound and substantive reorientation for modern architecture as a whole. Key to this rethinking was Mises' transformation into purely material terms of the fictive language of representation. In the process, the previously hard and fast distinction between the abstract and the representational was suspended, and representation reemerged as a credible and meaningful mode of modern expression. Thanks. I hope I didn't take too long, did I? Sorry. Some people I know had to leave, but I got nervous. I mean, do you normally take questions or no?
Yeah, I trust you'll take questions.
Well, yeah, I'd love to. I must say, the first time I was telling, they won't be like the first time I gave this lecture or what this was based on when I lectured in Chicago. And Mises' nephew was in the audience. And I thought I was going to be run out of town. I also thought I was in danger of losing my job, but that's another story.
You don't think we'll run you out of town?
No, I don't think people care here as much as they do in Chicago about Mies and his political whatever. Are there any questions? Yeah, Graham.
just wondering if you can speak a little bit, maybe put in more direct dialogue, this sort of political connotations, the political implications of the collage that you showed, and then those mid-30s sketches with swastikas.
Yeah.
Because it does seem like...
And to say what?
just to put those maybe, to speak more about...
Oh boy, I mean...
Sort of how those mid-30s sketches might be at work as well then, those political implications.
Oh, they certainly do. They certainly do. But there, the difference was, I mean, I think the technique of drawing for Mies was, architects can correct me if I'm wrong, was a way of saying almost naturally what you think. I mean, it's like I write, architects draw. And so those drawings were an expression of his thinking. And those drawings were, if you will, a natural expression of his thinking. I believe the collage was a way of placing an intermediary between him and what he thought. I don't believe he could have drawn those mountains in Wyoming, is I guess what I'm saying. I don't think he could have drawn an assembly bomber plant that was bombing Germany. It was a way of distancing himself, as I said, from those facts. I don't think, and this is the whole political interpretation, it's what we normally say in pop art, that you put quotation marks around the thing. In other words, it's a mediated representation. I don't think the swastikas and the eagles were mediated in the case of the Berlin projects. I think they stood on the wall or above the building just like the figures in the Huber House does, as part of the environment, which Mies controlled completely as a draftsman. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
To follow up on that, with the Huber House, you say, there's like a sort of Heimlich versus the Unheimlich and the resort, so what about there's a sort of Heimlich to the perspectives generally, and I would add to that there are a series of perspectives in the early IIT buildings that similarly have a comfortable relationship between inside and outside and are less displaced and all of that. So is it just the domesticity of the region? Well,
I think there are also, every, there's always a kind of underside. I mean, one chooses, one edits. The political term today is cherry picks. There are a lot of drawings, I must add, of the Rieser House that look like the Huber House. They're sketches. We're talking about the drawings he makes to represent the project. That has to be kept in mind. These are the drawings that will stand for his conception of the Rieser House. They all ended up in the Museum of Modern Art. They all were seen in exhibitions. And it's very interesting in this regard, and it's one reason I focused to some degree on saying how important, for instance, the concert hall was for Mies. Mies had, what I cut out of the lecture, I was just trying to keep it down in terms of time, but both the museum in the small city and the concert hall were done as part of, let's say, in relation to student thesis projects at IIT. Paul Campagna for the concert hall and George Danforth for the museum. Now, I interviewed both those architects. Both those architects sort of claimed ownership of those projects. It was very interesting. Problem was that Paul Campagna couldn't remember where he got the photograph from, and he remembered having a gold Japanese screen. It didn't tie in with the project. Granted, Mies did those projects in relation to the thesis project. Would Mies have exhibited as a major project in his first retrospective in America in 1947 a student project that he supervised? Would Philip Johnson have called it the greatest work Mies has done? Would Franz Schulze, who interviewed the same people, have called it, this? So those collages were really major works of art by Mies, and giving it again to Mary Callery, and her replacing that figure of the Mayol with, and if those of you who've seen color reproductions of it will see the Egyptian scribe in the foreground. It says something completely differently. It's not uninteresting to analyze, but it's not what Mies did. So in other words, these were charged images. I think it just makes the point that these were projects for Mies that I would dare say were as important as any of the individual buildings at IIT. Certainly the concert hall was taken as such, although he hadn't built anything really by then. But he continued to think of it as a major project. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's just, you know, and I just think that it was a very important method of approach.
There are two categories of technique that by and large go through your talk. One is one of whiteout,
yes,
and the other one is of a kind of technological representation, or say a more material manifestation, which means I-beams on the outside,
right, which is collage,
or brick, or whatever it might be. The whiteout always happens on the inside, more or less, and the technological or the representation of stuff always happens on the outside. I'm trying to figure out, first of all, whether or not we should be satisfied with that. In other words, should we imagine that that's simply a product of the buildings are objects from the outside and we can read them as stuff, and we don't tend to read them that way on the inside, which seems a little unsatisfying to me. And I'm also then, in light of that set of poles, those two poles, I'm wondering about a project like the Friedrichstrasse Tower, which could be conceived of as a kind of exterior whiteout.
Yeah, so there's a reversal layer.
Right.
Well, the whiteout thing is, I hadn't thought of that. That's very interesting. It's also very logical, because people who build glass houses can't see the structure when they're looking out. In other words, that it's almost natural that the structure becomes invisible, so to speak, as light comes through from the outside. I don't think that's the answer. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. It's an interesting point. You'd have to look at other drawings that Mies did, and he did do drawings of the interior of Lakeshore Drive, and see how it works there. But that would be something to have to think about, and to see whether, in fact, aside from its being true, which I think seems like it is true, whether it gets you anywhere.
I wonder if it falls apart a little bit at the moment when he draws things by hand. In other words, there's a certain mechanical production in the collages,
or photomontage,
and even the use of maybe a knife in the drawings, for example.
Right.
That when he draws, he's obliged to, when he sketches, he's obliged to actually produce surfaces and renditions of things that become stuff in the sketches.
Yeah, but then you come to the bigger question, another question, which is what interests me, because as we talked before, I mean, I'd begun to work on architecture and photography. I never knew I was talking about photography in this case. I only thought I was talking about architecture, and I realized that it's been a thing that I've been interested in for a long time. And I begin to look at ways in which architects use photography. And Mies, and it's just important to consider, for the major representational, and now I'm using the word in the normal sense of the word, the major representational images of his buildings, did ultimately, although he was a beautiful draftsman, we don't know his drawings, like the Huber House drawing. You never see the Seagram building drawn like that. I mean, Michael Hayes will show a sketch, but those are very rare. We tend to see the kind of finished, and in many of these cases, collages. So the question becomes, and I began to look at other architects, and for instance, both Gropius, I mean, we know photomontage was used a lot by Lissitzky in the 20s. But both Gropius and Le Corbusier used photomontage in the 20s. Their examples are not as well known. But you always think about Le Corbusier's drawings when it's not the photographs of the buildings, as representing the buildings, even as late as Ronchon or whatever. You never think about Mies's drawings as representing the buildings. It's always, so he relied on this technological process, which means something, just as he relied on technology more overtly and explicitly to carry the meaning of his building. So you'd have to take it through that filter too, and accept the fact we all know is that Mies was interested in technology probably more than most architects at that time, or interested in technology as a means for carrying the meaning of the buildings. But the positive-negative thing is obviously something that could be developed and should be thought through. I think it's important. Yeah?
I really like the transformation from the cruciform column to the I-beam, and the sort of change in representation. The I-beam was ready-made,
Yes.
something that you found.
Yeah.
And that somehow was putting on display you said, the abstraction and anonymity of modern life, the military industrial complex, which is in some ways that's processing in the period of the 30s and 40s, that alienation, exile, kind of existentialist themes that you're referring to, that then come out more positive like post-war. What I've always, it's a really powerful reading. What I've always felt is disappointment, and maybe you have a different take on it, is the fact that as he moved on in his career, and in the Seagram building, he made the I-beams custom bronze, and covered the shear wall with marble, which makes me think that the rhetoric of the ready-made, or the language that you were referring to, the mode of representation that you were referring to in pop art, was somewhat undercut by the more aesthetic appeal that bronze and marble and a custom-made section ultimately bring to it. And in some ways, it pushes it a little back towards the crucible.
Okay, there's a good answer to that, and then there's the real answer. Whatever. The good answer is that, that Jasper Johns is bronze too. Very elegant, very elegant. It's not a real light bulb, it's a bronze light bulb. Whatever. So that's the good answer. The real answer, and this may not be the answer, but there's always a critique. I mean, the same thing happened in Don Judd's work. Don Judd started with using materials like galvanized iron, and maybe even simple uses of straight stainless steel. And then toward the middle to later part of his career, he started using colored plexiglass and copper and different colored pastel paints and all that sort of stuff. And everyone said something akin to what you're saying, that it became pretty, that it became, that it lost the earthiness and the grittiness of the connotations that, let's say, galvanized had with the world of industrial production. So, I think it's true.
It changes its representational.
I think it's true, but what the answer that you could give in the case of Mies is that, as a lot of artists, one could make the case that he was representing himself. In other words, that he came to represent the representation. And yes, he represented his idea and made it more permanent in bronze. I mean, you could make that case. I think, though, ultimately, from the point of view of this lecture, which doesn't go there, that's the reason I ended up with the Seagram building rather than dealing with it throughout, because it is what you said. It is a more elegant solution, and it is a solution that is already a commentary on the previous work. There's something, to be honest, I've avoided thinking through.
But he returned to the.
That's the real reason. No, I've avoided, because I think you're right, in a sense. It doesn't have that. I would never describe it in those terms, but it did represent the same thing. And maybe more powerfully. I mean, if you can compare, take that cover of that magazine, which I don't think is seen, I don't think it's ever. I have a copy of it because I worked as news editor for Architectural Record in 1963, and we received it in the mail. I think Harvard doesn't own it. I don't know who owns that magazine, but it's a fabulous image. And if you had put a photograph of the Lakeshore Drive on the cover, it wouldn't have carried the same power as the Seagram Building. Even though we look at the Seagram Building, as you describe it correctly, as more elegant, more refined, more a working through. So what does that mean? I think ultimately it's not just the size or the singularity of the shape. It is the closeness of the I-beams. It is the fact that they create more of a sense of a body and have less void between the I-beams that gives it a more powerful presence. So you could, you'd have to work on it, is what I'm saying. I can't answer that question, but I think the answer exists.
I don't think the ready-made dog hunts. I think you're barking up the wrong tree there.
In the Seagram Building.
He's
the one who brought it up.
No, you brought up the ready-made. He's just endorsing you. I actually think I don't buy it.
It does.
I have no idea why Mies would want to pursue the ready-made. I have no idea.
For the same reason that Jasper Johns did.
No, I think that's Neil. That's not Mies. I think that's something else.
It's all bronze.
For one, he returns to the cruciform in the National Gallery.
On the outside.
Those columns are actually super sophisticated.
Actually, they're two cross. They're actually
but they're even more complicated or kind of.
Well, but when you have the National Gallery, you're also dealing with going back to Germany. There are probably other things that are on his mind at that time. There's the grid of the ceiling. There are other things that he's doing. So you'd have to do an analysis. We'll do Levine's.
Other questions?
Are you here to break up this whole?
I didn't get to do the introduction.
This is one level lower question. Is there a connection between how buildings were rendered, say the 50s and 60s, especially Miesian buildings? I recently saw an exhibition in Mexico City of many modern architects who were practicing in the Miesian style, and there seemed to be a very cohesive way they rendered these Miesian buildings and attracted landscape. That you could date palm trees, the way they grew a palm tree between offices. Within 5 years, as they moved, you could date the drawing based on the trees. They're very expressive, playful drawings, but the buildings are very exact. Except the quality is very expressive. The way they're always rendered. Is that something of its time?
I haven't studied that. I don't know for you. Does anyone know? I haven't studied that. Mies certainly dominated the scene in Chicago, and everyone did things that looked just like it, buildings and renderings. But I don't think Jacobi was involved with that. The photography, yes, Henry Blessing was important as photographers, but I don't see many buildings by Mies that we actually think of through reproductions of drawings, even the buildings that weren't built. I think like the McCarty factory. There's a model, so we see. And a lot of people followed that, whether it's Kevin Roach or a lot of people who came out of that, followed in terms of building models. I don't know. Interesting question. I don't know the answer.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Thanks a lot.